From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden weighs in on a looming national railroad strike as voters in Georgia head to the polls for the Senate runoff between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Kim Strassel. Welcome to you both. In September, the Biden administration helped broker a tentative deal between railways and union representatives, but subsequently 4 of the 12 rail unions then voted down the deal, which raises a threat of a strike of railroads in early December. Let's start with White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre discussing this yesterday.
It matters. It matters that Secretary Walsh has been in direct contact with the rail workers. It matters that Secretary Buttigieg has been in touch with the companies. And it matters for certain that Secretary Vilsack has been in touch with the agricultural sector. And that's going to continue. Those conversations will continue to happen. Again, the president has been very clear. A shutdown is unacceptable. It will hurt families, communities across the country. It will hurt jobs. It will hurt farms. It will hurt businesses. And it just should not be happening.
Monet, you've been following this from the beginning, so I wonder if you could set the table for us a little bit here. What are the railroads and the unions arguing over, and how did we get where we are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, the railroads and the rail worker unions are in the midst of labor negotiation process, which has actually lasted years. They began formal talks about 2 years ago with a target of being able to set salaries, benefits, and other conditions for rail workers for the next 5 years, but they've been unable to reach a final agreement. So basically, in September, the Biden administration intervened because they wanted to make sure there was no possibility of a strike. If they got to a certain deadline without being able to agree, the default position would be for the rail workers to go on strike, and that would have a devastating impact on the economy, of course. And so the Biden administration brought both sides to the table with the goal of hammering out a deal. They did reach a tentative agreement, and the unions then had to take that back to their workforces to vote on it. 8 out of the 12 railroad unions did approve it, but 4 of them, including some of the largest ones, rejected it because they believed that the deal on offer didn't offer them enough paid leave, basically sick pay on short notice for their workers. And so they decided to say, we'd rather potentially risk a strike as opposed to going for this deal. The latest change now is that the Biden administration came out just this Monday and said that if the two sides are unable to reach a deal, Congress can vote to impose the deal that they agreed to in September. So the Railway Labor Act gives Congress the ability to settle it, and now President Biden has urged Democrats to vote in favor of imposing a deal. So it seems as if a strike is likely to be averted now.
But Monet, I wonder if you could give us a sense of your view of the contract that was negotiated or suggested, brokered by the Biden administration. So some of the reporting says that the proposal would raise wages by almost 25% between 2020, which was when the last contract ended, and 2024. But what about this issue of time off, medical time off? Who's pitching toward the middle there, if that's a way that I can say it? Is it the unions that are changing what they want and keeping demanding more? Is it the railroads that are not going to meet reasonable requests on behalf of their employees, or maybe a little bit of both?
Well, on its face, the deal does seem very favorable to the rail workers. I think it's important to understand that even before President Biden directly intervened, he appointed a presidential emergency board in July, which was given the task of laying out basic terms that should be agreeable to both sides. And it was that presidential emergency board that recommended the 24% wage increase over the next 5 years, that offered as much as $16,000 in back pay to some of these rail workers, and also sort of protected their very high quality healthcare plans. So that the terms are good for rail workers on their face. What they were seeking was a mandatory expansion of paid leave. So right now, they're able to negotiate for paid leave policies with each rail carrier, but there isn't an agreement that covers the entire industry. But the Presidential Emergency Board explicitly rejected their request for an industry-wide minimum on paid leave, basically saying that the railroads have chosen to expand their pay over the past several decades at the direct expense of having a more generous paid leave policy. So it is true that they don't have a very high minimum of short term paid leave, but that's a consequence of their own negotiations in the past. And I think almost anyone looking at the deal from a neutral standpoint would say that it is very favorable to rail workers.
Notable to me, though, that President Biden is now calling for Congress to impose this deal on the railways. And here's a piece of his statement. He says, as a proud pro labor president, I'm reluctant to override the ratification procedures and the views of those who voted against the agreement. But in this case, where the economic impact of a shutdown would hurt millions of other working people and families, I believe Congress must use its powers to adopt this deal. And Kim, I think that is a striking turn for President Biden. He was apparently one of only 6 senators who voted against a bill in 1992 that ended a rail strike. And he's been a very pro union president. I've heard him say a few times that he sleeps next to a union member. That, of course, is Jill Biden, who I believe is a member of the National Education Association, one of the two big teachers' unions. So, Kim, what do you make of this turn by the president on this question of a rail strike?
It really is quite remarkable because he came also to office pledging to be the most pro-union president in the history of the country. And if you look at what he has done, otherwise, he's gone a long way toward that. His National Labor Relations Board is really being very radical in the way they're rewriting policy to favor unions. He still has been pushing Congress to enact the PRO Act. They haven't had the votes for that, but he's been a big advocate for it. If you look at, for instance, the infrastructure deal that was passed and other legislation, it's been very generous in terms of union provisions, wage and labor standards, et cetera, and getting jobs specifically to union members. And I think what the White House is very worried about here is that this nonetheless becomes the defining action of the president that really goes down as his legacy and undercuts that whole pro union position. On the other hand, the president kind of got himself into this. If you go back and look at the history, he was the one that really intervened and sort of rushed both of these sides into agreement so that he could claim victory on this prior to the election. And in doing so, he foreclosed the opportunity for Congress to extend the bargaining period a little bit. So now here we are, and 4 of these major unions have rejected it. And you can see why the economic consequence would be devastating if the president were not to ask Congress to intervene. We can talk a little bit about that, but an estimated 700,000 jobs lost, $1 billion a week in costs. Prices would go up another 4% on top of inflation. And then there's the smaller granular problems that could come, in particular supply chains. Just one example somebody was telling me is that some of the things that could be disrupted, for instance, are water treatment chemicals that go out to cities and are fundamental for their ability to keep clean water running to people's houses. Motor fuel, for instance, suddenly you are looking at the potential of lines at gas stations and shortages, and all of this happening right in the holiday season. And that's what's got the White House spooked and why he's now going down this road.
But if the strategy for the White House now is to have Congress impose this deal, I guess the next question is whether that can get through Congress. Remember, we still have a Democratic Congress. Republicans have won the House, but that transfer of power doesn't take effect until January. So Speaker Nancy Pelosi is saying, here's a quote from her, this week the House will take up a bill adopting the tentative agreement with no poison pills or changes to the negotiated terms and send it to the Senate. But Kim, in the Senate, the problem there is always the Senate filibuster, the requirement to get 60 votes to end debate and get a piece of legislation over the hurdle. And there are some senators on the left side of the chamber, and I'm thinking particularly of Bernie Sanders, who are already saying that this deal does not go far enough. So, Kim, do you think that even with President Biden's backing, that this legislation will sail through Congress, or whether there'll be some hiccups there?
Interestingly, not just people on the left. Marco Rubio just came out today, and this was him on Twitter saying the railway and workers should go back and negotiate a deal that the workers, not just the union bosses, will accept. But if Congress is forced to do it, I will not vote to impose a deal that doesn't have the support of the rail workers. So that's Marco Rubio going populist. Now, you don't assume that most Republicans would fall in that place. And I would imagine that the vast majority of the GOP would vote for this, and probably a significant number of Democrats in order to support the president. I think the bigger question is more the dynamics in the Senate and the ability of one senator or two to really delay things. That's the question I think you get with a Bernie Sanders or even a Marco Rubio. If they want to throw up a lot of objections, you could delay this vote potentially past December 9th, which is when the strike would begin. Again, we'll have to see how the dynamics shape up. Right now, I think there's certainly the votes to do it, but procedurally, this could get a little bumpy.